The nurse's hands move too fast, too certain. The EMT fumbles the IV and she steps in without asking, her fingers finding the vein in 3 seconds flat.
Where did you learn that?
She doesn't answer. Never does. Just finishes the insertion and walks away like she didn't just demonstrate combat medic precision in a rural Kentucky ER. Her badge says March. Her locker holds no photos, just a locked metal box she touches every morning but never opens. She counts 47 steps from her car to the entrance, freezes when helicopters pass overhead, works the night shift where nobody asks questions, until tonight. The highway pileup brings 12 critical patients through the doors in 20 minutes. Blood everywhere, chaos spreading, and when a patient starts dying on the table, her hands don't hesitate. She cuts into his chest with surgical confidence no civilian nurse should possess, reaches into the chest cavity, stops the internal bleeding at the source. The room goes silent. Everyone's staring.
That's military protocol.
Combat surgery.
She stands there, blood to her elbows, and realizes her 5-year secret just shattered.
From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of hidden courage and impossible choices move you, consider subscribing. Because some truths can't stay buried when lives hang in the balance. And tonight, they're about to discover exactly who she's been hiding from.
The digital clock on the dashboard read 4:47 when the faded blue Honda Civic pulled into the County General Hospital employee parking lot. The car, a 1998 model, kept immaculately clean, slowed to a precise stop in space 47, third row from the entrance. The engine cut off. Silence filled the pre-dawn darkness, broken only by the distant hum of the emergency room generators and the soft tick of cooling metal. Inside the vehicle, Lorelei March sat motionless for exactly 30 seconds. Her hands remained on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, fingers relaxed but positioned with deliberate care. She checked the rearview mirror twice, scanning the empty lot behind her with the systematic attention of someone performing a checklist rather than simple caution. Nothing moved in the darkness, no headlights approached. The parking lot stood empty except for the scattered vehicles of other night shift workers. She released the steering wheel and stepped out into the cool Kentucky morning. October air carried the smell of wet asphalt and distant pine. Mist clung to the ground in patches, swirling around her ankles as she locked the car door, tested the handle twice, and turned toward the hospital. Her scrubs were already pressed and perfect, dark, blue fabric without a wrinkle. No jewelry adorned her hands or neck. No polish colored her nails. The only marking on her person was a plain digital watch set to military time, the numbers glowing faintly green in the darkness. Lorelei walked toward the employee entrance, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she counted. 1, 2, 3. The habit was automatic now, invisible to anyone who might have been watching. 47 steps from her car to the door. Always 47. The number meant something once, though she tried not to remember what. Her feet knew the path without conscious thought, avoiding the uneven section of pavement near space 32, and the drainage grate that sometimes caught unwary heels. The employee entrance opened with a mechanical buzz after she swiped her badge through the reader. Fluorescent lights flooded the narrow hallway beyond, harsh and clinical after the soft darkness outside. The smell hit her immediately, that particular combination of antiseptic, floor cleaner, and something underneath that might have been fear or pain, or simply the accumulated weight of human suffering contained within institutional walls. She inhaled slowly through her nose, held it for a count of 4, and entered. The badge reader had flashed her name across its small screen. L. March, RN, night shift, nothing more. No emergency contact information. No previous employer listed in the system beyond the bare minimum required for licensure verification. Just a name that might or might not have been real, attached to a person who showed up precisely on time, did her work with mechanical efficiency, and left without engaging in the small social rituals that bound other people together. The locker room stood empty at this hour. Lorelei moved directly to locker 47, her fingers working the combination lock from memory. The door swung open to reveal an interior that would have told anyone watching exactly nothing about the person who used it. Spare scrubs hung on the hook, pressed and folded. A small toiletry bag sat on the upper shelf, containing only the necessities. No photographs decorated the metal walls. No personal items cluttered the space. except for the box. It sat in the back corner of the locker, small and metal and locked with a combination that had never been written down. The surface bore no markings, no indication of origin or purpose. Lorelei's hand moved toward it automatically, a ritual performed every morning without conscious thought. Her fingers touched the cold metal, traced the edge of the lid, then withdrew. She never opened it here, never exposed its contents to the fluorescent light and possible observers. But she touched it every morning, confirming its presence before closing the locker and moving on. The staff break room hummed with the white noise of old appliances and tired machinery. Lorelei entered to find the coffee maker already gurgling through its cycle, brown liquid dripping into a pot marked with the accumulated stains of 1,000 prior shifts. She moved to the counter with practiced efficiency, measuring out grounds for a second pot with the same precision she applied to medication dosages. 2 scoops, exactly level. Water to the 12-cup line. While the machine worked, she poured 2 cups from the first pot, leaving them on the counter without labels or names. The second cup sat exactly 4 inches from the first, handles parallel to the counter edge. Someone would claim it, someone always did. "You're early again?" The voice came from behind her, familiar and resigned. Lorelei didn't turn immediately, finishing her task before acknowledging the speaker. Pauline stood in the doorway, late 50s, with 23 years at County General, etched into the lines around her eyes and the comfortable way she filled out her scrubs. She was one of the few who made any effort at conversation, though even Pauline had learned not to push too hard against the walls. None that Lorelei maintained. "Traffic was light," Lorelei said, her voice neutral and functional. "It's 5 in the morning. Traffic is always light." Lorelei's hand moved to her watch, adjusting the band with unnecessary precision. "Better safe." Pauline studied her for a moment, that same searching look Lorelei had learned to deflect without seeming to notice. The older nurse shook her head and claimed the second coffee cup, wrapping both hands around it as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid. "You know, most people use the commute as an excuse to come in late, not early. I'm not most people." "No, you're really not." They stood in silence, the only sound the drip and hiss of the coffee maker completing its cycle. This was their routine, repeated 5 nights a week with minimal variation. Lorelei made coffee. Pauline took the second cup. They exchanged a handful of words that meant nothing and everything, depending on how closely you listened to what wasn't being said. Then they went to work. But Pauline lingered this morning, her eyes tracking Lorelei's movements as the younger nurse rinsed her cup in the sink and dried it with paper towels. "You ever think about joining us for the staff dinner next month? Just casual, nothing fancy." "I don't think so." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Pauline sighed, the sound carrying more sadness than frustration. "You've been here 4 years, Lorelei. Maybe 5. I honestly can't remember when you started, which is strange because I remember everyone's first day. But you just appeared one morning like you'd always been here, and you've never let anyone get close enough to actually know you." Lorelei turned to face her directly, meeting her eyes for precisely 2 seconds before looking away. "I'm here to work, not socialize. Everyone's here to work, but we're also human beings who spend 40 hours a week together. It wouldn't kill you to be friendly." "I am friendly. You're polite. It's not the same thing." The conversation had ventured into territory Lorelei preferred to avoid. She moved toward the door, carrying her coffee with both hands to prevent the possibility of spilling. "I should start rounds." Pauline let her go, but her voice followed down the hallway. "One of these days, someone's going to figure out what you're running from." Lorelei's step didn't falter, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She kept walking. The emergency room floor at County General operated on a different rhythm during night shift. The chaos of daytime, with its scheduled procedures and visiting families and doctors making rounds, gave way to something quieter, but no less intense. The lights stayed bright, the monitors continued their eternal beeping, but the energy changed. Night shift belonged to a skeleton crew of nurses and 1 or 2 attending physicians, handling whatever came through the ambulance bay doors. Lorelei moved through her assigned section with methodical efficiency. Patient in Bay 3, post-car accident observation, stable vitals, no changes overnight. Patient in Bay 7, possible appendicitis awaiting surgical consult. Pain managed, resting. Patient in Bay 12, elderly man with COPD, oxygen saturation declining slightly, but within acceptable parameters. She paused at Bay 12, studying the monitors before approaching the bed. Mr. Carver had been admitted 3 nights ago, his chronic condition flaring badly enough to require hospital intervention. He slept now, his breathing labored but steady, the oxygen cannula positioned correctly in his nostrils. Lorelei checked the flow rate, confirmed the tank level, and made a note on his chart. His eyes opened as she worked, roomy and tired but alert. "You're the quiet one." "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Carver." "No, you do it different." He coughed, a wet rattle that spoke of fluid and inflammation and systems beginning to fail. "Like you've done it 1,000 times before. In worse places?" Lorelei's hand paused fractionally on the IV line she was adjusting, then continued smoothly. "I've been a nurse for a long time." "That's not what I mean." His breath whistled through damaged passages. "My son was in the Army, medical unit, Afghanistan. He had that same look you got. Like nothing here is as bad as what you've already seen." She finished her work without responding, updating his chart with precise notation about fluid intake and output. Mr. Carver watched her the entire time, his gaze carrying weight she refused to acknowledge. When she finally moved to leave, his voice stopped her at the curtain. "Thank you for taking care of me. Whatever you've been through, wherever you came from, you're really good at this. Better than good." Lorelei nodded once and left. The curtain swished closed behind her, cutting off whatever else he might have said. Dr. Reyes stood at the nurse's station, reviewing charts and drinking what smelled like his 4th cup of coffee. He was young for an attending early 30s, with the kind of confident competence that came from natural talent rather than years of grinding experience. He looked up as Lorelei approached, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "March, how's our COPD patient?" "Stable, declining slowly but within expected parameters. He'll need the surgical team to evaluate his long-term options, but nothing acute tonight." "Good." Reyes set down his coffee, studying her with an intensity that made Lorelei want to step back. She held her ground, meeting his gaze for the socially required moment before looking at the charts between them. "You've been here how long?" 4 years. 5, actually. I checked." He picked up his coffee again, using the gesture to soften what might have been an interrogation. "You started 3 months before I did. I remember because HR mentioned we had a new night nurse who just transferred from out of state. If you say so, where were you before? Kentucky? Does it matter?" "No, I guess it doesn't." He sipped his coffee, grimaced at the taste, and set it down again. "It's just strange. You're one of the best nurses on this floor. Maybe the best. You catch things before the monitors do. You're calm in emergencies. You never miss details. But nobody knows anything about you beyond your name and the fact that you show up on time and do excellent work." Lorelei began organizing the charts on the desk, arranging them by priority with movements that looked casual but achieved perfect order. "I prefer to keep my personal and professional lives separate. Most people keep them separate. You keep them in different universes." Reyes leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "No emergency contact in your file. No previous employer references beyond the bare minimum for licensure. You rent a trailer outside town and pay in cash. No social media. No family visits. It's like you appeared out of nowhere 5 years ago and decided to become invisible." The charts were arranged now, color-coded and prioritized. Lorelei's hands stilled on the desk, but her expression remained neutral. "Is there a problem with my work?" "Your work is flawless. That's actually part of what bothers me." "You're bothered by good performance?" "I'm bothered by perfection, by someone who never makes mistakes, never gets flustered, never shows any sign of being affected by the things we see here." He gestured toward the emergency room behind them, where human suffering played out in a dozen different flavors every night. "You're too calm, March, too controlled, like you're always waiting for something worse to happen." A monitor alarm sounded from Bay 4. Lorelei moved immediately, grateful for the interruption. "I should check that." Reyes watched her go, his expression troubled. He didn't stop her, but his gaze followed until she disappeared behind the curtain. The alarm was routine, a patient shifting position and dislodging a sensor. Lorelei corrected the problem, reassured the worried family member, keeping vigil, and made a note in the chart. But her hands trembled slightly as she worked, a betrayal of the calm exterior she maintained. Reyes was asking questions, paying attention, seeing things she'd worked hard to keep hidden. She would need to be more careful. The shift continued through the small hours of morning, that dead time between midnight and dawn when the world seemed to hold its breath. A drunk driver with minor injuries, a teenager with a suspected overdose, a construction worker who'd fallen from a scaffold and broken 3 ribs. Routine emergencies, if such a thing existed. Lorelei handled each with the same efficient competence, her movements economical and precise, her documentation flawless. At 6:30, as the night shift prepared to hand over to the incoming day team, she clocked out with mechanical precision. 12 hours logged, not a minute more or less. She retrieved her empty thermos from her locker, touched the metal box without opening it, and walked back to her car through the strengthening dawn light. The drive home took 15 minutes along empty county roads. Pine trees lined the highway, their shadows long in the morning sun. Lorelei drove exactly at the speed limit, using her turn signals even when no other vehicles were visible, her eyes constantly checking the mirrors out of habit rather than necessity. Pine Grove Mobile Community sat just outside the town limits, a collection of manufactured homes arranged in neat rows with gravel roads and minimal landscaping. Lorelei's unit occupied space 47, naturally, at the back corner, where 2 empty lots provided a buffer from her nearest neighbors. The Honda pulled into the carport and stopped. She sat for 30 seconds, scanning her surroundings before exiting. The trailer interior would have disappointed anyone hoping to learn about its occupant. Sparse didn't adequately describe the aesthetic. Functional, came closer. Everything served a purpose. Nothing existed merely for decoration or comfort. The small kitchen contained the minimum necessary appliances. The refrigerator held meal prep containers labeled by day and time, each portion measured and balanced. The pantry shelves showed canned goods arranged by category and expiration date. The bedroom was similarly austere, a single bed with military-tight corners on the sheets, 1 pillow, a small nightstand holding a lamp, an alarm clock, and a wooden box approximately 8 inches square. Lorelei set her thermos on the kitchen counter, removed her shoes, and placed them in the closet at a precise angle and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hand moved to the wooden box without conscious decision. This one wasn't locked. She opened it slowly, revealing contents that would have meant nothing to a casual observer, but carried the weight of years for her. A small patch of faded fabric, military insignia, barely visible after countless handlings, a photograph folded in half, the crease worn white from being opened and closed too many times. She didn't unfold it now, didn't need to see the faces captured in that moment before everything changed. Instead, she removed the fabric patch and held it in her closed fist, feeling the worn texture against her palm. The alarm clock showed 7:30. She had 7 hours before she needed to return to the hospital. 7 hours to sleep, to eat, to maintain the minimal existence she'd constructed in this nowhere town where nobody asked questions and nobody expected answers. She lay down on top of the covers, still fully dressed except for her shoes, the patch hidden in her hand. Her eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. The rhythm was automatic, learned long ago in a different life. A technique for managing stress and maintaining control when control was the only thing between survival and collapse. Outside, birds began their morning songs. Traffic on the distant highway created a low hum of civilization, continuing its endless patterns. Inside the trailer, Lorelei March lay motionless and awake, holding a piece of fabric that represented everything she'd walked away from and couldn't quite leave behind. The alarm went off at 2:30. She'd been awake for the past hour, her body refusing the rest her mind demanded. This was normal. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds that might have been dreams or might have been memories. The distinction had blurred over time. She rose and moved through her afternoon routine with the same precision as her morning one. Shower. Exactly 8 minutes. Dress in fresh scrubs. Eat meal prep container labeled Thursday p.m. Check weather forecast. The last item made her pause, her hand hovering over her phone screen. Severe weather warning. Thunderstorms developing. Possible tornado conditions. Her jaw tightened. She closed the weather app and pocketed the phone. The drive to County General took place under darkening skies, clouds building in towering formations that promised violence. Wind had picked up, pushing against the Honda and making the steering require constant correction. Lorelei's knuckles showed white on the wheel, her breathing deliberate and controlled. Thunder rumbled in the distance as she pulled into the parking lot. Space 47. 30 seconds sitting motionless. Check mirrors. The routine held even as her pulse elevated and sweat gathered on her palms despite the cool air. Lightning flashed, bright enough to leave after images. She flinched, muscles tensing before she forced herself to relax. It's just weather. Just a storm. Nothing else? The mantra didn't help much, but she repeated it anyway as she exited the car and walked toward the employee entrance. Dr. Reyes was waiting by the nurse's station when she arrived, his expression concerned. You saw the weather? Yes? We're getting prep calls. From Highway Patrol. Storms already causing accidents on the interstate. They're expecting a busy night. Understood. He studied her face, searching for something she refused to let him see. You okay? You look pale. I'm fine. The words came out sharper than intended. She softened her tone. I'm ready to work. Pauline arrived for her shift, saw Lorelei's expression, and wisely said nothing. The three of them worked together to prepare the emergency room for the expected influx, checking supplies, confirming equipment functionality, reviewing triage protocols. The routine tasks helped. Lorelei focused on concrete actions, measurable preparations, things she could control while the storm built outside. At 8:47, the dispatch radio crackled to life with a burst of static and urgent voices. Everyone in the ER stopped what they were doing, attention snapping to the speaker. County General, this is Highway Patrol Dispatch. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 127, northbound lanes near mile marker 14. Initial reports indicate 7 vehicles involved, multiple casualties, possible fuel fire on scene. First ambulances are en route, ETA approximately 8 minutes. Expect 15 to 20 patients, various severity levels. Dr. Reyes grabbed the radio. County General acknowledging, we're prepping trauma bays now. How many critical? Unknown at this time, scene is still being secured, fire department en route, weather is complicating rescue efforts. The radio went silent. For 3 seconds nobody moved, then training and experience took over, and the emergency room erupted into controlled chaos. Staff scattered to their assignments, voices calling out confirmations and updates, equipment being wheeled into position. Lorelei stood at the nurse's station, one hand gripping the counter edge, her face completely blank. March. Reyes appeared beside her, his hand on her shoulder. I need you on triage. You're the best we have at fast assessment. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the radio speaker, seeing something beyond the present moment. Thunder crashed outside, close enough to rattle the windows. March! His voice sharpened. I need you here, now. Can you do this? Something shifted in her expression, a door closing on whatever internal struggle had frozen her. When she looked at Reyes, her eyes were clear and focused. How many vehicles? What? How many vehicles in the pileup? They said 7. Why does that matter? She didn't answer, already moving toward the trauma bay entrance. Her walk changed, became more purposeful, each step placed with conscious precision. She positioned herself near the ambulance bay doors, her body angled to see both the entrance and the treatment area, maximizing situational awareness without consciously thinking about tactical positioning. The first ambulance screamed into the bay at 8:55. Paramedics burst through the doors, pushing a gurney, their faces grim. Male, approximately 40 years old, penetrating chest trauma from steering column, possible pneumothorax, BP dropping. We've got him on oxygen, but he's struggling. Lorelei stepped forward, her hands already moving to assess the patient before the gurney stopped rolling. Her fingers found his pulse, counted the rhythm, evaluated the quality. Her eyes scanned his chest, noting the asymmetrical rise and fall, the slight bluish tint to his lips. Her ear went to his chest, listening to breath sounds that were absent on the right side. Penetrating chest trauma, probable pneumothorax on the right. Prep trauma, bay 1 for chest tube insertion. I need a portable x-ray standing by. Type and cross for 4 units of blood. "Someone get me Dr. Reyes now." The words came out in a different voice than her usual quiet tone. This voice carried command, expected instant obedience, had spoken in situations where hesitation meant death. The staff responded automatically, moving to fulfill her orders before their conscious minds registered the change. Reyes appeared as they wheeled the patient into Trauma Bay 1. "March, I didn't authorize chest tube yet. You have about 4 minutes before his lung collapses completely. Look at his tracheal deviation. Feel this." She placed his hand on the patient's neck, guiding him to the anatomical landmark she'd identified. "He's shifting into tension pneumothorax. We decompress now, or we lose him." Their eyes met. In that moment, Reyes saw something in her expression that made his medical questions irrelevant. This wasn't a nurse making suggestions. This was someone who knew, with absolute certainty born from experience he couldn't fathom, exactly what needed to happen and exactly how fast. "Do it," he said. Lorelai's hands moved with practiced precision, prepping the insertion site, guiding the resident through the procedure with calm, specific instructions. The chest tube went in smoothly. Air hissed out under pressure. The patient's color improved immediately. Crisis averted, but there was no time to celebrate. The second ambulance had arrived. Female, mid-20s, massive leg trauma, possible femoral artery involvement. We've got a tourniquet on, but she's lost a lot of blood. Trauma Bay 3, get me O-negative blood, 4 units, start running it now. Prep for vascular surgery consult. The third ambulance, the fourth, the fifth. They kept coming, a steady stream of broken bodies and critical decisions. Lorelai moved between them like a conductor directing an orchestra, her voice steady and calm while chaos swirled around her. She was triaging patients faster than Dr. Reyes could confirm her assessments, prioritizing based on criteria that seemed to exist in some internal algorithm only she could access. A young EMT struggled with an IV insertion on a patient in Bay 5. Lorelai appeared beside him, her hands guiding his without taking over completely. 15-degree angle, not 90. You're looking for the bounce, not the collapse. Feel for the flash, then advance. There. Perfect. The EMT stared at her. "How did you know the exact angle?" "Experience." She was already moving to the next patient. Dr. Reyes caught her between bays, his expression a mixture of professional admiration and personal concern. "March, where did you learn to triage like this? This is mass casualty protocol, military-level stuff." She met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then looked away. "I've worked emergency medicine for a long time. Not like this. Nobody works like this unless they've been trained for combat situations or disaster scenarios. You're not just good at your job. You're operating on a completely different level. We have patients waiting. I know, but after this is over, we're going to talk about what I'm seeing here, because something doesn't add up." The 7th ambulance arrived at 9:17. Lorelai had been managing the controlled chaos for 22 minutes straight, her uniform soaked with other people's blood, her hair escaping its tight arrangement, but her hands remained steady, her voice calm, her decisions instant and accurate. The paramedics rushed through with a patient on a backboard, their faces showing the strain of the scene outside. Male, approximately 40, multiple trauma, metal penetration from vehicle debris, severe bleeding, semi-conscious. Lorelai turned toward the approaching gurney. Something about the patient registered in her peripheral vision, a detail her brain processed before her conscious mind engaged. The jacket he wore, faded tactical design, specific patch on the shoulder, barely visible beneath the blood and torn fabric. She went completely still. The world narrowed to that patch, that specific configuration of fabric and thread that represented something she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Her breathing stopped, her vision tunneled. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to get away, to not look at the face of the man on that gurney because seeing him would make everything real again. But she couldn't move, couldn't look away. The paramedics wheeled him closer, calling out vitals she could hear but couldn't process. Someone was talking to her, asking questions, but the words turned to noise against the roaring in her ears. The patient's eyes opened, clouded with pain and shock. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the people surrounding him. His gaze found Lorelai. Something flickered in those eyes, recognition fighting through the trauma and medication. Her lips moved, forming a word she had no memory of speaking. Boone. The emergency room went silent for a heartbeat, every person within hearing distance registering the impossibility of what they'd just witnessed. This patient had no identification visible. No chart had preceded him. The paramedics hadn't mentioned a name. There was no way she could have known who he was, unless she'd known him before. Ma'am, the lead paramedic, stared at her. Do you know this patient? Lorelei's professional mask slammed back into place, but everyone had seen it crack. She stepped forward, her hands reaching for the patient even as her face remained expressionless. Sergeant Boone, Army, type O negative, allergic to penicillin. Next of kin is a sister in Colorado. Dr. Reyes materialized beside her, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. March, how do you know all that? She didn't answer, couldn't answer, because answering would require explanations she'd sworn never to give, would mean acknowledging a past she'd buried, along with the 4 people who died because she wasn't fast enough, skilled enough, lucky enough to save them all. The patient on the gurney made a sound, wet and desperate. Blood was spreading across his abdomen, soaking through the field dressings the paramedics had applied. His blood pressure was dropping. His skin had the grayish tint that meant shock was setting in, deep and fast. Lorelei looked at his injuries with eyes that had seen this exact scenario play out in circumstances far worse than a Kentucky highway in a thunderstorm. She knew what was happening inside his body, knew what needed to be done, knew that the procedures required weren't in any civilian emergency room protocol because they were designed for battlefield conditions, when transport wasn't an option, and death was the only alternative to radical intervention. Get him to Trauma Bay 2, clear everyone else out. I need a thoracotomy tray, rib spreaders, and internal paddles on standby. Someone find the trauma surgeon and tell them we're going in now. Reyes grabbed her arm. March, that's not your call to make. We don't have authorization for emergency thoracotomy without confirmed indication. She turned to face him fully, and whatever he saw in her expression made him release her arm and step back. This wasn't the quiet night nurse who counted her steps and avoided eye contact. This was someone else, entirely. Someone who had made decisions like this when hesitation meant watching people die. His injuries include probable laceration to the descending aorta. He's bleeding into his chest cavity. We have maybe 8 minutes before he codes, and when he does, closed chest compressions won't save him because the blood isn't staying in the system. We go in now, we clamp the bleeder, we give him a chance, we wait for authorization, we call his sister to arrange the funeral. The patient made another sound, weaker this time. Blood pressure dropping further, time running out. Do you know how to perform an emergency thoracotomy? Reyes asked the question already knowing the answer, seeing it in her stance and her certainty, and the way her hands had already moved to position the patient for the procedure. Yes. Where did you learn? She looked at him, and for just a moment let him see past the walls she'd built. Let him see the weight of every decision made under fire, every life saved, and lost. Every night spent counting the hours until dawn brought another chance to do it again. Does it matter? He studied her face, making calculations that balanced policy against pragmatism, rules against reality. Then he nodded once. Glove up, I'll assist. Someone get me that trauma surgeon now. Lorelei moved, her hands transformed into instruments of precision, every motion economical and exact. She scrubbed rapidly, pulled on gloves, positioned herself at the patient's side. The room had gone quiet except for the beeping of monitors and the urgent shuffle of staff preparing equipment they rarely used. Scalpel. The blade touched skin. She cut with absolute confidence, following a path her hands remembered from training, repeated until muscle memory took over. Rib spreader positioned. The chest cavity opened. Blood welled up, confirming her diagnosis. Probable laceration to the descending aorta. She was already reaching in before anyone could question the action. Her hand entered the chest cavity, fingers searching by, feel for the injury her eyes couldn't see through the blood. She found it, located the bleeder, applied pressure to control the hemorrhage while her other hand guided Reyes to provide suction. The room held its collective breath, watching a procedure that belonged in war zones and disaster areas, being performed by a woman who supposedly had spent the last 5 years working quiet night shifts in rural Kentucky. Clamp. I need a vascular clamp. Now. The instrument appeared in her hand. She placed it with practiced precision, occluding the damaged section of aorta, stopping the bleeding at its source. The patient's blood pressure stabilized. Color began returning to his face. The crisis had passed. Lorelei stepped back, blood covering her gloves up to the elbows, her scrubs soaked, her hair falling loose from its tie. She stripped off the gloves mechanically, dropped them in the biohazard container, and turned to leave. "March, doctor." Reyes's voice stopped her at the door. "That procedure, that's called a clamshell thoracotomy. It's not in civilian protocols. It's not something you learn in nursing school. Where did you learn to do that?" She didn't turn around, couldn't face the questions in his eyes and the faces of everyone else who had watched her perform the impossible. "I need to check on the other patients. The other patients are stable. We need to talk about what just happened." "Not now." "Yes, now. Because what I just witnessed was someone with advanced trauma training performing a procedure that requires specialized combat medical certification. That's not something you pick up reading textbooks, March. That's hands-on experience in high-casualty situations. So, I'm going to ask you again, and this time I need an actual answer. Where did you learn to do that?" The room had gone completely silent. Everyone waiting for her response. Everyone seeing past the careful mask she'd maintained for 5 years. The invisible woman had become very visible, and there was no way to put that particular truth back in its box. Lorelei turned slowly. Her face was blank, wiped clean of expression, but her eyes held something that might have been fear or grief or simply exhaustion at maintaining the lie for so long. "I learned it in the field, under fire, when waiting for the trauma surgeon wasn't an option because the trauma surgeon was already working on 3 other critical patients and someone had to make the call." The words hung in the air, admission and explanation and warning all at once. Dr. Reyes stared at her, pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the quiet nurse who counted her steps and kept no photographs in her locker. A voice spoke from near the nurse's station, older and carrying authority. "I've only seen that procedure performed twice in my career, both times by forward surgical teams, combat medics operating, in active war zones." Everyone turned. The speaker was a senior paramedic, late 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd seen more than their share of trauma. He was watching Lorelei with an expression of dawning recognition. "You're military," he said, not a question. Lorelei's jaw tightened. She looked at the blood still coating her hands, at the patient she'd just saved, at the faces surrounding her that no longer saw a quiet night nurse, but something else entirely. Something she'd worked so hard to bury. "I was," she said finally, the words forced out through a throat that wanted to close. "A long time ago. How long have you been living with a truth you couldn't share, watching others overlook the very thing that makes you extraordinary, because revealing it would mean facing everything you've been running from?" If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to hear more about the quiet heroes walking among us, the ones who save lives without asking for credit, who carry their past like a locked box they touch but never open, who count their steps and measure their coffee and wait for the day when someone finally sees them for who they really are. The supply room door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the ringing silence of her mind. Lorelei's legs carried her forward on autopilot, her body moving while her brain remained locked in the moment she'd just left behind. The confession, the admission. 5 years of careful construction demolished in 3 words. "I was military." Her hands found the edge of the sink and gripped hard enough to make her knuckles white. The metal was cold and real and anchoring. She stared at her reflection in the paper towel dispenser, the warped surface showing a distorted version of her face. Blood still streaked her forearms despite having stripped off the gloves. Someone else's blood. Boone's blood. A man she'd operated on 7 years ago in Kandahar when her hands had been just. As bloody and the stakes just as high, but the context completely different. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. Didn't have the energy to maintain the mask anymore. Whoever had followed could see what they wanted to see. She was too tired to care. "Lieutenant Hawthorne." The voice was male, measured, carrying the particular weight of someone who understood exactly what those 2 words meant. Not her current name, not the identity she'd constructed and maintained with such careful precision. Her real name, her rank. The person she'd been before everything fell apart. Lorelai's breath caught. She still didn't turn, but her entire body went rigid, every muscle locked in place by sheer force of will. Only one type of person would use that form of address. Only someone who'd been there, who'd served, who understood the protocols and the weight of rank even in civilian spaces. You have the wrong person. No, I really don't. The man moved into her peripheral vision, positioning himself where she could see him without forcing direct eye contact. Late 40s, crew cut, going gray, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform, even if he wasn't wearing one now. State police insignia on his jacket, but beneath that, something else. The way he stood, the respect in his posture, military, former military. Someone who recognized what he was looking at, even when it was hidden beneath scrubs and 5 years of careful lies. My name is March, Lorelai March. I'm a registered nurse. That's all. Your name is Hawthorne, Lorelai Hawthorne. Lieutenant, United States Army, 274th Forward Surgical Team. He spoke quietly, not accusation, but statement of fact. You served 3 deployments, Iraq twice, Afghanistan once, 8 years active duty, specialized in mass casualty management and emergency surgical intervention in hostile environments. She finally turned to face him, her expression carefully blank, despite the way her heart was trying to hammer through her ribs. Who are you? Captain Marcus Griggs. I was with the security detail that pulled convoy protection for your surgical team outside Fallujah in 2019. He paused, letting that sink in. I watched you operate on 18 men over the course of 6 hours while we took sporadic fire from buildings we couldn't properly secure. You saved every single one of them. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The bridge, the ambush, the convoy spread out along the road, with nowhere to go and enemies in the buildings on both sides. Her surgical team setting up in the only cover available while security forces tried to keep them alive long enough to work. Blood everywhere. Screaming. The sound of gunfire so constant it became background noise. Her hands moving from patient to patient, making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was already gone. I lost 4 men that day. No, you lost 4 men in Helmand Province in 2020. Different mission, different circumstance. In Fallujah, everyone lived. I was there. I know. She gripped the sink harder, using the physical sensation to keep herself grounded in the present. What do you want? I want to understand what you're doing working night shifts in a rural Kentucky hospital when you should be teaching trauma surgery or running an emergency medical program somewhere. His voice gentled slightly, though the authority never left it. I want to know why someone with your training and experience is hiding behind a fake name in a place where nobody asks questions. I'm not hiding. You're absolutely hiding. The question is why. Thunder crashed outside, close enough to rattle the building. Lorelai flinched before she could stop herself, the sound triggering associations she'd spent 5 years trying to suppress. Griggs saw the reaction, and something in his expression shifted to understanding. The Helmand incident. That's what you're running from. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because speaking it out loud would make it real again, would drag her back to that road and that day and the 4 faces she saw every time she closed her eyes. Lieutenant. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Whatever happened that day, whatever you think you did or didn't do, running away and hiding your skills doesn't honor their memory. It just wastes what you are. You don't know what happened. I know what the reports said. I know 4 members of your team were killed when an IED hit your convoy during a medical evacuation mission. I know you stayed on that road for 9 hours, triaging casualties under fire while extraction teams tried to secure the area. I know you saved 23 people that day despite losing 4. He paused. And I know you left the service 2 weeks later and disappeared. The numbers were right. The facts were accurate. But facts didn't capture the reality of watching people you'd worked beside every day for 2 years die in an instant while you were powerless to stop. Facts didn't explain the guilt of surviving when others didn't. Facts were sterile and clean and nothing like the actual experience of living through hell. I need to get back to my patients. In a minute. First, I need to tell you something. Griggs stepped closer, his voice taking on an edge of intensity that made her finally meet his eyes. I was in that convoy, in Helmand. Not the same vehicle as your team, but close enough to hear everything on comms. close enough to see the aftermath. She went completely still, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation. Found none, just brutal honesty and the particular kind of pain that came from remembering things no human should have to witness. You were there. I was there. And I'm alive because you operated on me in a ditch while mortars were landing close enough to throw dirt on us both. You dug shrapnel out of my abdomen with field instruments while telling me terrible jokes about why army doctors make bad. Comedians. You saved my life, Lieutenant, along with 18 others that day. The memory came back in fragments. The overwhelming number of casualties. The impossible decisions. Working on someone while explosions rocked the ground and made her instruments shake. A face she barely remembered through the blood and chaos, but the voice was familiar now that he mentioned it. She'd made jokes. Dark, inappropriate humor, because that was the only way to keep herself functional when everything was falling apart. Griggs, you were the sergeant with the sucking chest wound. Captain now, and yes, you plugged the hole, stabilized me, and moved on to the next patient like it was routine, like you did it every day and twice on Sundays. He smiled without humor. I wrote you up for a commendation, Silver Star. They approved it 3 weeks after you'd already left the service. She absorbed this information numbly, too emotionally exhausted to process its implications. I didn't want recognition. Nobody who deserves it ever does. He gestured toward the door, toward the emergency room beyond where people were probably still talking about what they'd just witnessed. But you can't hide anymore, Lieutenant. Too many people saw what you did tonight. They're gonna have questions, and you're gonna have to decide whether you keep running or whether you finally stand still long enough to let yourself heal. Before she could respond, a voice called from the hallway outside. Captain Griggs, we need your statement about the accident scene when you have a moment. He nodded toward the unseen speaker, then looked back at Lorelei. I have to go, but we're not done with this conversation. You saved my life. I owe you more than I can ever repay. The least I can do is make sure you don't waste the rest of yours hiding from something that wasn't your fault. He left. The door swung closed. Lorelei stood alone in the supply room, surrounded by shelves of sterile equipment and medical supplies, her reflection staring back at her from a dozen different surfaces. All of them showed the same thing. A woman who'd been found, a secret that had been exposed, a past that refused to stay buried no matter how deep she tried to bury it. She washed her hands mechanically, scrubbing away the blood with movements that had become ritual. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. But her hands still felt dirty. 5 years of hiding couldn't be washed away in a sink, no matter how hard she scrubbed. The ICU occupied the second floor, accessible by stairs or elevator. Lorelei took the stairs, needing the physical movement to burn off the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Her legs felt shaky, unreliable, but she forced them to carry her upward one step at a time. Counting helped, always counting. It gave her mind something to focus on besides the way her entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. 28 steps to the second floor. Turn right. 14 steps to the ICU entrance. Swipe badge. Wait for the door to unlock. Enter. The ICU nurse on duty looked up from her station, recognition flickering across her face. Word had already spread. Of course it had. Hospital gossip moved faster than any official communication system. The quiet night nurse who never talked about herself had just performed combat surgery in the emergency room. That kind of story didn't stay contained. He's in Bay 4, the nurse said without being asked. Stable. Dr. Reyes is with him now. Lorelei nodded and moved past, her footsteps silent on the tile floor. The ICU was dimmer than the ER, lights lowered to promote rest and healing. Monitors beeped in rhythmic patterns, creating a strange mechanical symphony of continuing life. She paused outside Bay 4, gathering herself, then pushed aside the curtain and entered. The patient lay propped at a 30-degree angle, multiple IV lines running into his arms, monitors tracking every vital sign. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady but labored. Dr. Reyes stood beside the bed, reviewing the chart, his expression thoughtful. He looked up when she entered, and something complicated passed across his face. Not quite accusation, not quite respect. Something in between that might have been reassessment of everything he thought he knew. He's stable. The procedure you performed bought him time for proper surgical repair. He'll need additional work, but he'll live. Reyes set down the chart. He was asking for you, called you by a different name, Hawk. The nickname hit her like a physical blow. Nobody had called her that in 5 years. It belonged to a different person in a different life, before everything changed. Hearing it now, in this sterile hospital room, thousands of miles from where that identity had meant something, felt surreal and painful and oddly grounding all at once. It's what they called me, in the service. Who is he to you? Someone I worked on before. Different place. Different time. She moved closer to the bed, studying the patient's face with clinical detachment layered over deeper recognition. Sergeant First Class Daniel Boone, scout sniper, took shrapnel to the chest outside Kandahar in 2018. I removed it in a field hospital while he complained about the food and asked if I was single. Despite the tension, Reyes almost smiled. Sounds like military humor. It was how we stayed sane. The patient's eyes opened, clouded with pain medication, but aware enough to track her movement. His lips moved, forming words that took effort to produce. Hawk. Knew it was you. Knew those hands. Lorelei's professional mask threatened to crack. She forced it to hold, moving to check his vitals with the same efficiency she'd shown in the ER. You're supposed to be retired, Sergeant. So are you, Lieutenant? His voice was rough, damaged by the breathing tube they had removed an hour ago. What are you doing in Kentucky? Working? Running? His eyes held hers with surprising intensity given his condition. Same thing I heard about half the team after Helmand. Some people went back to work. Some people went home. Some people just disappeared. He coughed, wincing at the pain the movement caused. You disappeared. Dr. Reyes watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone assembling a puzzle from scattered pieces. He didn't interrupt, but his presence was a reminder that this conversation wasn't private, that whatever was revealed here would spread through the hospital before morning. I'm not running, I'm living quietly. That's what running looks like when you're good at it. Boone's hand moved slightly, reaching toward her with fingers that could barely lift from the blanket. They told you it wasn't your fault, the ambush, the IED, the 4 we lost. Her jaw tightened. They were wrong. No, they were right. And you've spent 5 years punishing yourself for something you couldn't control or prevent. He let his hand fall back to the bed, exhausted by the small effort. Martinez, Chen, Okafor, Vasquez. I knew all of them. Good people, good soldiers. They died doing their jobs, same as any of us might have on any given day. That's the risk we accepted when we signed up. I was supposed to keep them safe. You were supposed to provide medical care under combat conditions. You did that. Nobody could have saved them from a direct IED hit. The after-action report said they died on impact, before you could even reach them. The report was wrong. The report was written by people who examined the scene, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed all available evidence, but you've decided your guilt is more reliable than their investigation. He closed his eyes, breathing carefully around the pain. That's ego, Lieutenant. Thinking you could have changed something nobody could have changed. Thinking you're responsible for an enemy action you had no control over. Reyes cleared his throat softly. I should give you two some privacy. No need? Lorelei stepped back from the bed, rebuilding the walls that had cracked during the conversation. The sergeant needs rest. I'll check on him during rounds. She turned to leave, but Boone's voice stopped her at the curtain. It's good to see you again, Hawk. Even if you don't want to be seen. Even if you've been hiding behind a different name in a place where nobody knows what you are. She didn't respond, couldn't, because responding would mean acknowledging the truth in his words, and she wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. The hallway outside was empty. She leaned against the wall, pressing her palms flat against the cool surface, breathing through the panic that wanted to overwhelm her. Too many people knew now. Too many people had seen. The careful anonymity she'd maintained was shredding like wet paper, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, voices in conversation. Lorelei straightened immediately, smoothing her expression into neutrality, preparing to face whatever came next. But instead of confrontation, the passing nurses simply nodded at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been curiosity, or might have been both. They didn't stop. Didn't ask questions, just acknowledged her presence and moved on. Small mercies. The hospital was quieter now. the storm outside having passed, and the initial wave of casualties from the highway accident stabilized or transferred to surgery, the ER had returned to its normal night rhythm, handling routine emergencies with practiced efficiency. Lorelei returned to her section, checking on patients, updating charts, maintaining the careful routine that had defined her existence for 5 years. But everything felt different now. People watched her differently, spoke to her differently. The young EMT she'd taught earlier approached with obvious hesitation, his expression mixing awe and uncertainty. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you for teaching me, for showing me the right way to do the IV insertion." He paused, working up courage. "And for what you did tonight, that surgery. I've never seen anything like that. You shouldn't have to. That procedure is for extreme circumstances only. But you knew how to do it. You didn't hesitate." He studied her face, searching for something. "How long were you deployed?" The question hung in the air between them, direct, personal. Exactly the kind of inquiry she'd spent 5 years deflecting. But deflection felt pointless now, when half the hospital already knew or suspected the truth. 8 years, 3 deployments. And you came back and just started working regular hospital shifts? Something like that. He wanted to ask more. She could see the questions forming behind his eyes, but training or instinct or simple respect kept him from pushing further. He nodded once and returned to his work, leaving her alone with the EUC, her thoughts and the monitors that beeped their eternal patterns. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and careful avoidance of meaningful conversation. Lorelei moved through her rounds with mechanical precision, documenting everything, checking vitals, adjusting medications. The work was grounding, familiar, a lifeline of normalcy in a night that had upended everything. At 6:30, she clocked out. Exactly 12 hours, not a minute more or less. The locker room was empty when she retrieved her things, touching the metal box without opening it as always. But the ritual felt different now, loaded with meaning it hadn't carried this morning. The box held her past, and her past had just caught up with her whether she wanted it to or not. The parking lot was bathed in early morning light, the storm having cleared overnight to reveal a washed-clean sky. Lorelei walked toward her car, keys in hand, mind already turning toward the drive home and the attempt to process everything that had happened. Captain Griggs stood beside her Honda Civic, leaning against the driver's door with the casual patience of someone who had all the time in the world. He straightened when he saw her approaching, his expression neutral, but his presence a clear indication that their earlier conversation wasn't finished. "We need to talk." "I'm off duty. I need to sleep. This won't take long." He moved away from the car, giving her space but not leaving. "I've been thinking about what you said in the supply room, about losing 4 people, about feeling responsible. I don't want to discuss this. I know, but I need to tell you something, and you need to hear it." He waited until she looked at him, making eye contact that carried the weight of shared experience. "I pulled the official report on the Hellman incident. I have clearance through my current position. I wanted to understand what happened." She went rigid, every instinct screaming at her to get in her car and drive away. But her feet stayed planted, her body refusing the escape her mind demanded. The IED that hit your convoy was command detonated. Enemy forces watching the road, waiting for the right moment to strike. They targeted the medical vehicle specifically because they knew taking out your surgical capability would have cascading effects on the entire operation. He spoke carefully, each word deliberate. The 4 people who died were killed instantly by the blast. Catastrophic injuries. The investigating officer's report explicitly states that no medical intervention could have saved them. They were gone before the debris stopped falling. That's not what I remember. Memory isn't reliable in traumatic situations. Your brain was flooded with stress hormones, working overtime to keep you functional in an impossible scenario. What you remember is trying to reach them, trying to save them, and finding them already dead. But what actually happened is they died instantly, and you were never given a chance to try. She shook her head, rejecting the narrative even as part of her recognized its truth. I should have been faster, should have gotten to them sooner. You were treating 3 other critical patients when the IED detonated. You were already working at maximum capacity. Even if you'd been standing right next to them, you couldn't have prevented their deaths. He stepped closer, his voice gentling. You saved 23 people that day, under fire, in conditions that would have broken most trained professionals, but you've spent 5 years focused on the 4 you couldn't save, instead of the 23 who are alive because of you. The 4 matter more. They matter equally. Their deaths weren't your failure. They were casualties of war, random violence that took good people before their time, the same violence that could have taken you, or me, or any of us, on any given day. He pulled something from his pocket, a piece of paper folded carefully. This is the list of people you saved that day. Their names, 23 of them. I tracked down their current status, all alive, some still serving, some retired, some dealing with injuries and trauma, but alive, because of you. He held out the paper. She stared at it like it might burn her hand. I can't. You can. You just don't want to. Because accepting that you saved them means accepting that you did everything humanly possible, which means releasing the guilt you've been using to punish yourself. He pressed the paper into her hand, closing her fingers around it. Take it. Read it when you're ready. Learn about the lives you saved, instead of only remembering the deaths you couldn't prevent. The paper felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She wanted to throw it away, to reject the absolution it represented. But something in his expression, in the weight of his words and the authority of his experience, made her pocket it instead. Why are you doing this? Because you saved my life? Because I recognize what you're going through. And because I've seen too many good people destroy themselves over survivors' guilt when they should be celebrating the fact that they survived and using their skills to keep saving lives. He stepped back, giving her room. You're better than this, Lieutenant. Better than hiding in a nowhere town under a fake name, wasting everything you are because you can't forgive yourself for something that was never your fault to begin with. She had no response to that, no defense against the brutal honesty. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove away while he watched from the parking lot, his figure growing smaller in her rearview mirror until he disappeared entirely. The drive home happened automatically, her body steering while her mind processed the conversation. The paper in her pocket felt like a burning coal against her leg. She didn't take it out, didn't look at the names, but knowing they were there changed something, fundamental in the carefully constructed narrative she'd maintained. 23 people alive because of her, against 4 dead despite her. Mathematics of survival, metrics of success and failure, cold numbers that didn't capture the reality of loss, but might, eventually, provide a framework for understanding that she'd done her job under impossible circumstances, and nobody could have asked for more. Her trailer sat exactly as she'd left it 12 hours earlier. Unchanged, unchanging. A monument to stasis and safety, and the careful management of a life deliberately kept small. She sat in the carport for longer than her usual 30 seconds. Hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. This is Dr. Reyes. I know you're off duty, but need you to know what's happening at the hospital. People are talking. Word has spread about who you are and what you did. Thought you should be prepared before your next shift. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the delete button, but deleting it wouldn't delete the reality it described. Her secret was out. Her past was public. And there was no putting that particular truth back in its container. She went inside, set her phone on the counter, and moved to her bedroom on autopilot. The wooden box sat on the nightstand, calling to her with the weight of ritual and memory. She opened it slowly, removing the faded fabric patch that represented everything she'd been and tried to stop being. The insignia was barely visible now, worn by countless handlings over the years. She held it in her closed fist, feeling the texture against her palm, letting herself remember what it had meant to wear this openly. Pride, purpose, identity as something more than just a person, but as part of a team, a mission, a calling that transcended individual survival. 4 names written in Sharpie on the back. She never looked at them directly, couldn't bear to see the permanent reminder of permanent loss, but she knew they were there, carried them every day even when the patch stayed hidden in the box. Martinez, Chen, Okafor, Vasquez, her team, her responsibility, her failure. Except Griggs said they weren't, said the official report cleared her of any fault, said their deaths were instantaneous and unavoidable, said she'd saved 23 others while her brain was too locked in survival mode to properly process what was happening. She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the absolution he offered, but 5 years of guilt and grief didn't dissolve with a single conversation and a piece of paper listing names she'd saved instead of lost. The alarm went off at 2:30. She'd been lying on top of the covers, still fully dressed, not sleeping, but not quite awake either, existing in that liminal space between consciousness and escape. The patch was still clutched in her hand, the fabric damp from sweat and pressure. She showered, dressed, ate her scheduled meal. Mechanical routine, autopilot existence. But today felt different, loaded with meaning and anticipation. She was returning to the hospital after everything had changed. People knew. Questions would be asked. The careful invisibility she'd maintained was gone. The drive happened in a fog of anxiety and resignation. Storm clouds were building again, the weather forecast calling for more severe conditions. Another night of potential chaos. More opportunities for her skills to be needed, more chances for the mask to slip completely away and reveal what she'd been trying to hide. County General's parking lot was fuller than usual for early evening. Extra staff called in for storm preparation. She found space 47 occupied and had to park in 48 instead. The small deviation from routine feeling significant in ways it shouldn't. The walk to the employee entrance took 49 steps instead of 47. Wrong. Disorienting. A physical reminder that everything had shifted, and nothing would be the same. Pauline intercepted her in the locker room before she could open her locker, her expression a complicated mixture of emotions Lorelei couldn't parse. "We need to talk. I need to prep for shift. Lorelei." The use of her first name stopped her cold. Pauline never used first names except in moments of genuine importance. "Everyone knows about you, about your service, about what you did last night." She paused, searching for words. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Because it wasn't relevant." "It's completely relevant. You're not just a good nurse. You're one of the best trained medical professionals in this hospital, and you've been hiding it for 5 years while we treated you like just another night shift worker." "That's what I wanted. But why?" Pauline's voice carried genuine confusion and hurt. "Why waste your skills? Why hide what you are?" Lorelei turned away, opening her locker and touching the metal box out of habit. "Because what I am killed 4 people who trusted me to keep them safe." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way Lorelei had never allowed herself to be with anyone at this hospital. Pauline absorbed them silently, processing implications and connections. "The people you lost, in the military, that's what you're running from." "I'm not running. You've been running since the day you got here, but maybe it's time to stop." Pauline moved closer, her voice dropping to something gentler. "Whatever happened, whatever you think you did or didn't do, punishing yourself by hiding your abilities doesn't honor their memory. It just wastes what you are and deprives people who need you of your best work." It was almost exactly what Griggs had said. Different words, same message. Lorelei felt the walls she'd built starting to crack under the sustained pressure of people who insisted on seeing her clearly despite her best efforts at invisibility. "I need to start my shift. In a minute. First, you should know what's waiting for you out there." Pauline gestured toward the door, toward the hospital beyond. "Dr. Reyes pulled your military records. Well, the parts that aren't classified. He shared them with senior staff. They know you have a Silver Star. They know you specialized in mass casualty management under combat conditions. They know you're trained to a level that exceeds most civilian emergency physicians." The cracks in the walls widened. He had no right to access those records. He had medical authorization based on your performance last night. He needed to understand what level of capability you actually possessed. Pauline's expression softened. "Nobody's angry, Lorelei. Nobody thinks you did anything wrong by keeping it private. But people are treating you differently now, with the respect you've earned but never accepted. You need to be ready for that." Lorelei closed her locker without retrieving anything, her mind spinning through implications and consequences. Everything she'd built, every carefully maintained boundary, all of it was dissolving. The invisible woman was becoming visible, and visibility meant vulnerability, meant exposure to exactly the kind of attention and expectation she'd been avoiding. "I don't want special treatment." "You won't get special treatment. You'll get appropriate recognition of your actual qualifications. Pauline touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of support. That's not the same thing, and it's long overdue. They walked to the ER together, Pauline talking about routine preparations for the expected storm, while Lorelei processed the implications of having her past exposed. The emergency room looked exactly the same as always. Same fluorescent lights, same smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner, same arrangement of bays and equipment. But the people were different, or rather, their response to her was different. Staff members who usually barely acknowledged her existence now nodded with obvious respect. The young EMT from last night smiled and raised a hand in greeting. Even Dr. Reyes, when he appeared from the trauma bay, met her eyes with something that might have been admiration mixed with curiosity. March, good, you're here. He gestured for her to follow him to the nurse's station, pulling up screens on the computer. We're expecting another difficult night. Storm's building. Highway Patrol is already reporting accidents. I want you on primary triage again. That's not my usual assignment. Your usual assignment was based on what we thought your capabilities were. Now that we know what you're actually trained for, I'm utilizing your skills appropriately. He turned to face her directly. Unless you have objections to being given responsibilities that match your qualifications. It was a trap, elegantly constructed. Objecting would mean explaining why she didn't want recognition of her abilities, which would require discussing the past she'd worked so hard to bury. Accepting meant stepping into the role she'd been avoiding, becoming visible in exactly the way she'd feared. No objections? Good, because I read your file. What wasn't classified anyway. And I need you to understand something. His voice dropped, became more personal. You're one of the most highly trained medical professionals in this hospital. Your combat experience and mass casualty training exceed most of what our attending physicians have encountered. I need that expertise tonight. The patients need that expertise. So, whatever reasons you have for hiding it, I'm asking you to set them aside for the next 12 hours and be who you actually are. Before she could respond, the dispatch radio crackled to life. Storm updates, road conditions deteriorating, multiple accident reports already coming in. The emergency room began its familiar transformation from calm to controlled preparation. Staff moving to their positions, equipment being staged, trauma bays being prepped. Lorelei moved into position near the ambulance entrance, her body falling into patterns learned through repetition in far more dangerous circumstances. Triage position. Maximum visibility of both entry point and treatment areas. Mental checklist running through protocols and priorities. She was doing it again, the transformation she'd tried so hard to suppress, becoming the person she'd been before everything fell apart. The first ambulance arrived, then the second, then a steady stream of casualties from storm-related accidents. Lorelei processed them with mechanical efficiency, her assessments precise and instant, her commands clear and confident. But something was different tonight. People weren't just following her orders. They were watching her with obvious respect, treating her input as authoritative rather than suggestive. The shift in dynamics should have been frightening. Instead, it felt oddly liberating. She didn't have to hide her competence, didn't have to soften her commands or defer to others who had less training and experience. She could simply be what she was and let the work speak for itself. Hours passed. The storm raged outside. Inside, controlled chaos continued under her direction. And slowly, incrementally, the identity she'd buried began emerging from the careful grave she'd constructed. The shift ended at 6:30. Lorelei clocked out mechanically, retrieved her things from her locker, and walked toward the exit. But instead of the empty parking lot she expected, she found herself walking into something else entirely. The staff break room door stood open, light spilling into the hallway. Voices inside, multiple people. Lorelei slowed, intending to walk past and avoid whatever was happening. But something made her glance through the doorway. The room was full. Every member of the night shift staff stood there, along with several people she didn't recognize from the day team. They weren't talking, weren't moving, just standing in rows. Facing the door, their expressions uniform in a way that made her stop walking entirely. Dr. Reyes stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. When he saw her in the doorway, something shifted in his expression. He stepped forward, extending his hand in a formal gesture. "Lieutenant Hawthorne, The use of her rank and real name in public, in front of everyone, made her breath catch. She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move forward or back, trapped by the weight of collective attention. "We know who you are, what you did, why you're here." He kept his hand extended, waiting. "You saved 12 lives last night. You performed a procedure that most surgeons couldn't execute under ideal conditions, and you did it in an emergency room with minimal support and no hesitation. You did it because that's who you are, despite spending 5 years trying to hide that fact from everyone, including yourself." She couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stand there while he closed the distance between them and took her unresponsive hand in both of his. "It's an honor to work with you, Lieutenant, an honor to have you on this team, an honor to finally recognize what you've been all along." One by one, the staff members stepped forward. Each one shook her hand or nodded with obvious respect. Some had tears in their eyes, the young EMT she'd taught, the senior paramedic who'd recognized her procedure, Pauline, whose hug threatened to break through the last of her defenses. Pauline whispered against her ear, voice thick with emotion. "You never had to hide." Lorelai's voice came out broken and raw. "Yes, I did. No, you chose to hide because facing what happened felt impossible. But you're not hiding anymore, and we're not letting you disappear again." The walls finally shattered. 5 years of careful control dissolved under the sustained weight of genuine respect and acceptance from people who'd seen her at her worst and best simultaneously. Tears came, despite her best efforts to suppress them, tracking down her face while she stood surrounded by colleagues who'd become something more without her noticing. Dr. Reyes spoke quietly, his words meant only for her, but carrying through the silent room. "Welcome home, Lieutenant. We've been waiting for you. Have you ever carried a truth so heavy you thought revealing it would destroy you, only to find that the people around you saw your strength all along and were simply waiting for you to see it too? If you've ever hidden your light because you feared what people would think, or if you know someone whose quiet competence deserves recognition they'll never ask for, let us know in the comments. And consider subscribing for more stories about the courage it takes to be truly seen. 3 weeks passed in fragments of transformation, so gradual they might have been invisible to anyone not watching closely. But Lorelai felt each shift like a tectonic plate moving beneath her feet, subtle but inexorable, changing the landscape of her carefully constructed existence one small earthquake at a time. The first morning after the recognition scene, she had arrived at the hospital expecting everything to be different and found instead that it was exactly the same, except for the ways it absolutely wasn't. The building looked identical. The parking lot occupied the same geographic coordinates. But when she walked through the employee entrance, people acknowledged her with nods that carried weight they hadn't before. Not pity, not curiosity. Something closer to respect, mixed with understanding that she'd spent 5 years actively avoiding. Her locker still occupied space 47. The combination hadn't changed. But when she opened it that first morning, she stared at the empty metal walls and made a decision that felt monumental despite its simplicity. She reached into her bag and removed the photograph she'd been carrying, folded and hidden, for 5 years. The crease down the middle had worn white from repeated opening and closing. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the worn paper against the locker door. 22 faces stared back at her. The 274th Forward Surgical Team, photographed in better days before deployment, when they'd still believed that skill and training could overcome any obstacle. She'd been in the front row, third from the left, wearing the same neutral expression she'd perfected even then. The 4 who died in Helmand stood in the back row, their faces frozen in youth and confidence that would never age or fade. She attached the photograph to the locker door with a small magnet, positioning it where she'd see it every time she opened her locker. Not hidden anymore, not folded away. Just there, present, acknowledged. Pauline found her standing motionless in front of the open locker, staring at the photograph. The older nurse studied the image without comment for a long moment before speaking. "They look young. We all were. You're still young. Younger than me by 2 decades. Pauline pointed to one of the faces in the back row. "Is that one of the 4? Martinez. He was 19. Wanted to be a surgeon when he got out. Had already been accepted to medical school." Lorelai's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. "He died instantly when the IED detonated. The report said he never felt anything. Do you believe that? I'm trying to. They stood together in the quiet locker room, two women separated by experience, but united in the particular understanding that came from witnessing too much suffering. Pauline didn't offer empty comfort or meaningless reassurance. She simply stood present, acknowledging the weight of loss without trying to diminish it. I'm making 3 coffees this morning, Lorelei said finally, breaking the silence. You, me, Dr. Reyes. He'll appreciate that. He's been running on fumes lately. Pauline touched the photograph gently, a gesture of respect. Thank you for sharing this with us, for letting us see who you were and what you've been carrying. They walked to the break room together. Lorelei measured coffee grounds with the same precision she'd always used, but this time the second and third cups had names attached to them. Small change, significant meaning, evidence of walls lowering incrementally, allowing connection she'd actively prevented for years. Dr. Reyes arrived as the coffee finished brewing, his expression showing the exhaustion of too many consecutive shifts. He accepted the cup she handed him with visible gratitude, wrapping both hands around it as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid. How'd you sleep? He asked, the question carrying weight beyond simple courtesy. Better than usual. Nightmares? The question would have been intrusive 3 weeks ago. Now it felt like genuine concern from someone who understood that trauma didn't dissolve with recognition or acceptance. Less frequent, still there, but manageable. He nodded, sipping. His coffee? I talked to administration about your position, your training qualifications. He paused, choosing words carefully. They want to create a new role, mass casualty coordinator, someone who develops protocols, trains staff, manages major incidents when they occur. The position would be yours if you want it. Lorelei's hand stilled on her coffee cup. I'm a night shift nurse. You're a decorated combat medical specialist whose training exceeds most civilian physicians in emergency trauma management. You can keep being a night shift nurse if that's what you want, but you could also use your actual capabilities to improve care for everyone who comes through these doors. I don't want administrative work. It wouldn't be primarily administrative. It would be hands-on training, protocol development, and active response during major incidents, teaching others to do what you do, raising the standard of care across the entire department. He set down his coffee, meeting her, eyes directly. You'd still work bedside, still take care of patients, but you'd also share what you know so that the next time something catastrophic happens, everyone is better prepared. She absorbed this slowly, turning it over in her mind. Teaching meant visibility, meant accepting recognition of her capabilities, meant stepping out of the shadows she'd inhabited for 5 years and into a role that would make her past an asset rather than a liability. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. The position will be there when you're ready. The shift that followed was the first of many that felt different in ways both obvious and subtle. Young residents shadowed her during rounds, asking questions she'd spent years deflecting. She found herself answering with technical precision, demonstrating techniques she'd learned in field conditions and refined through repetition. Teaching felt strange, uncomfortable, but also oddly satisfying in ways she hadn't anticipated. Residents struggled with a trauma assessment, missing signs that seemed obvious to Lorelei's experienced eye. She guided him through the proper sequence, explaining the why behind each step rather than just the how. You're looking for patterns, clusters of symptoms that indicate specific injuries. This patient has decreased breath sounds on the left, tracheal deviation to the right, and distended neck veins. What does that combination tell you? The resident processed the information, connections forming. Tension pneumothorax. Correct. You have about 6 minutes to decompress before he codes. What's your next move? The teaching continued throughout the shift, her voice growing more confident as she fell into patterns she'd used to train new medics in combat environments. The residents absorbed information with obvious appreciation, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite compliance. By the end of the shift, she felt exhausted in a different way than usual, not from hiding or maintaining walls, but from genuine engagement with the work and the people around her. It was uncomfortable and draining, and somehow more satisfying than 5 years of invisible efficiency. The second week brought more changes. A small plaque appeared on the nurse's station wall, positioned where staff would see it regularly, but not so prominently as to feel like showmanship. The text was simple and direct. Hawthorne Triage Protocol, Mass Casualty Response Guidelines. Developed by Lieutenant Lorelei Hawthorne, USA Medical Corps, retired. She stopped when she saw it, her breath catching, despite expecting something like this after her conversation with Reyes. Her name, her rank, her past made public and permanent on a wall where everyone could see. Pauline appeared beside her, studying the plaque with satisfaction. Reyes had it made, said if we're going to use your protocols, they should be properly attributed to their creator. I didn't create them, I just adapted military standards for civilian use, which required expertise most people don't have. Take the credit, Lorelei, you've earned it. She touched the plaque briefly, fingers tracing the engraved letters of her name. Not March, Hawthorne, the identity she'd been born with and tried to abandon. Seeing it displayed openly felt surreal and terrifying and oddly grounding all at once. My badge still says March. We can change that if you want. HR said they'd process a name change request with your consent. Did she want that? The question hung unanswered in her mind as she continued her shift, patience and protocols flowing with familiar rhythm. March had been safety, anonymity. The invisible woman nobody questioned or challenged. Hawthorne was exposure, recognition. The person she'd been before everything fell apart. By the end of the second week, she found herself in the HR office, filling out paperwork to officially change her badge and employment records to reflect her actual name. The clerk processing the forms treated it as routine administrative work, unaware of the significance the simple name change carried. The new badge arrived on day 16. L. Hawthorne, RN Night Shift. Former Lieutenant, U.S. Army Medical Corps. She stared at it for a full minute before clipping it to her scrubs, the small piece of plastic feeling impossibly heavy, despite weighing almost nothing. But she wore it through her entire shift, and with each hour that passed, it felt slightly less foreign against her chest. Day 21 fell on a Thursday, 3 weeks exactly since the highway accident that had shattered her carefully maintained anonymity. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, a stark contrast to the storms that had dominated recent weeks. Lorelei drove to work in the pre-dawn darkness, her mind quieter than it had been in years, despite the massive changes in her external circumstances. The shift was routine in the best possible way. No major emergencies, no catastrophic decisions, just steady work with patients who needed care, and staff who now treated her like a valued colleague rather than a mysterious stranger. She taught a resident proper chest tube insertion technique. She corrected a medication dosage before it could cause problems. She updated charts with the same precise notation she'd always used. At 6:30, she clocked out and walked to her car through strengthening dawn light. But instead of driving directly home, she found herself turning onto Highway 127, heading north toward the place she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. Mile marker 14 appeared ahead, the numbers small and easy to miss unless you were looking for them specifically. Lorelei slowed, signaling even though no other vehicles were visible, and pulled onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, hands remaining on the steering wheel, while she stared at the section of highway where 7 vehicles had collided during the storm. The road showed no evidence of the accident now. Pavement had been cleaned, debris removed, skid marks were fading under the constant passage of traffic. Within months, there would be nothing left to indicate that 12 people had nearly died here, that she'd saved them all, that her past had caught up with her in the worst and best way possible. She got out of the car slowly, walking to the edge of the shoulder and looking down the highway in both directions. Morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Birds sang in the trees lining the road. Life continued its endless patterns, indifferent to human drama and individual transformation. Her hand moved to her pocket, removing the small fabric patch she'd carried hidden for 5 years. The insignia was barely visible now, worn nearly smooth by constant handling. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight and texture, acknowledging what it represented. She could put it back in her pocket, could continue carrying it hidden, a private, memorial to what she'd been and lost. Or she could do something different, something she hadn't been ready for until this moment. Lorelei pinned the patch to her scrub collar, positioning it where anyone who looked would see. Not hidden anymore, not shameful, just there, part of who she was and had been and would always be, regardless of how much time passed or distance accumulated. The patch caught sunlight, the faded fabric somehow more visible for being worn. She touched it once, a gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance, then returned to her car and drove home. The trailer looked exactly as it always did. Same manufactured walls, same gravel driveway, same space 47 in the back corner where minimal landscaping met maximum privacy. But when she entered, something felt different. The air seemed lighter, the space less confining. Or perhaps she was different, and the space simply reflected that internal shift. She moved to her bedroom, to the nightstand where the wooden box sat waiting. For 5 years, she'd opened it ritually without ever fully engaging with its contents, touching, acknowledging, but never truly processing or integrating. The box had been a container for grief kept separate from daily existence, manageable only through compartmentalization and distance. She opened it now with the same care she'd always used, but her hands were steadier, her breathing more even. The contents revealed themselves in the strengthening daylight filtering through the bedroom window. Letters from families of people she'd saved, 18 of them, collected over her years of service, some formal, some heartfelt, all expressing gratitude she'd never felt she deserved. She read through them slowly, letting herself actually absorb the words instead of skimming and dismissing as she'd done countless times before. A photograph of her surgical team, the same image now displayed in her locker, but this copy older, more worn, the color slightly faded. She studied each face, remembering specific moments and shared experiences, the good days and the terrible ones, the successes and the losses, all of it together forming the complicated reality of service. Her silver star, the medal she'd received 3 weeks after leaving the military, forwarded to an address she'd used briefly before disappearing into rural Kentucky. She'd never worn it, never displayed it, just tucked it in the box with everything else she couldn't face. She held it now, feeling the weight of recognition for actions she'd believed were failures. The combat medic patch with 4 names written on the back in permanent marker: Martinez, Chen, Okafor, Vasquez. She'd written their names herself the week after the incident, needing something physical to represent loss she couldn't process any other way. The ink had faded but remained legible. She traced each name with her finger, speaking them aloud in the empty trailer. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I'm trying to forgive myself for that. Trying to accept that some things are beyond human capability even when we desperately wish they weren't." The words hung in the air, inadequate but genuine. She wasn't there yet, wasn't fully healed or resolved, but she was trying, which was more than she'd allowed herself for 5 years. She reached into her bag and removed something new, something that didn't belong to her past, but to her present. A photograph that had arrived in the mail 3 days ago with a note attached. The image showed 12 people, various ages and demographics, standing in front of County General Hospital. Some wore bandages, some used crutches, but all of them were alive, healed, whole. The note had been simple: "Thank you for saving us. We wanted you to know we're okay, that what you did mattered, that we're grateful." The Highway 12. She'd cried when she opened it, tears she couldn't control or suppress, not from grief, but from the gradual acceptance that maybe, possibly, she'd done enough. That, saving 12 people counted for something, even if she couldn't save 4 others. That her skills had value beyond the mistakes she'd made or the losses she'd endured. She placed the photograph in the box carefully, positioning it beside the older images, past and present together, loss and survival coexisting. The box stayed open on the nightstand, contents visible instead of hidden, evidence of integration rather than compartmentalization. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number she now recognized as belonging to Daniel Boone, the patient she'd saved during the highway accident. He'd been discharged from the hospital 5 days ago, recovered enough to return home with follow-up care instructions and a prescription for pain management. The message was characteristically direct. "Heard you're teaching now. Good, you should. Also heard you changed your badge back to Hawthorne. About time. Veterans Day ceremony next week. You should come. Let people see you." She stared at the message, thumb hovering over the reply button. Veterans Day, a public event, recognition of service. Exactly the kind of visibility she'd spent 5 years avoiding. The old Lorelei, the one who counted steps and hid photographs and measured coffee with mechanical precision, would have declined immediately, would have found an excuse, would have protected her anonymity at all costs. But that Lorelei was dissolving slowly, replaced by someone who was learning to integrate past and present instead of keeping them rigidly separate, someone who could acknowledge service without claiming perfection, someone who could accept recognition without believing she deserved it unconditionally. She typed a response slowly. "Maybe. I'll think about it." The reply came almost immediately. "Good enough. See you there." She set the phone down, a small smile touching her lips despite herself. Boone's certainty was either misplaced confidence or accurate assessment of how much she'd changed. Either way, the possibility that she might attend a public recognition of veterans represented transformation she couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. The alarm went off at 2:30, marking the end of her scheduled rest period. She'd slept better than usual, dreams occurring but not dominating, allowing actual rest rather than just unconscious time passing. She rose and moved through her afternoon routine with familiar efficiency. But small things were different. She left the wooden box open on the nightstand. She wore the patch pinned to her scrubs instead of hidden in her pocket. She drove to work without counting steps or measuring distances. Her mind focused on the shift ahead rather than rituals designed to maintain control. County General looked exactly the same as always, the building unchanged by her internal transformation. But when she entered, people greeted her by name, her real name, Hawthorne. Some added lieutenant. Most just acknowledged her presence with the casual respect of colleagues who'd moved past mystery into genuine professional relationship. Boone was waiting in the ER lobby when she arrived, mobile and mostly healed, wearing civilian clothes and a slight limp that would probably fade with time and physical therapy. He grinned when he saw her, the expression carrying mischief and genuine warmth. "Hawk, heard you're officially teaching now. Small classes, trauma protocols for residents. Saving lives twice, once in the field, now by teaching others to do it right." He fell into step beside her as she walked toward the employee entrance. That's legacy. That's what we're supposed to do with what we learned. Pass it on. Make sure the next generation is better prepared than we were. I'm just a nurse doing my job. You were never just anything, Hawk. Not in Kandahar, not in Helmand, not here. He paused, serious now. "You coming to the Veterans Day thing?" I said maybe, which means you're still deciding. I'll take that as progress. He studied, her face seeing past the neutral expression she'd perfected. "You look different. Less like you're carrying the entire world, and more like you've figured out how to set some of it down. I'm working on it. Good, because you saved my life twice now. Once overseas, once here. I'd like to return the favor by making sure you actually live instead of just existing." They parted at the employee entrance, Boone heading home and Lorelei moving into the hospital. But his words stayed with her through the shift, a reminder that survival and living were different things, and she'd spent too long doing only the former. The night passed in comfortable routine, teaching, treating, documenting. Pauline worked beside her, their partnership strengthened by mutual understanding and shared experience. Dr. Reyes consulted her on difficult cases, treating her input as authoritative rather than suggestive. The young residents asked questions and absorbed answers with obvious respect. She was becoming visible, present, integrated, and it was terrifying and uncomfortable and somehow fundamentally right in ways she couldn't fully articulate. At 6:30, she clocked out and returned to her car. But instead of driving straight home, she detoured to a store that opened early, the kind of place that sold frames and photo supplies alongside household necessities. She purchased 3 identical frames, simple black wood that wouldn't compete with the images they'd hold. The clerk made small talk she responded to with basic politeness, a small interaction that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. Home, shower, change into civilian clothes. Then the task she'd been planning since Boone's text message. She spread the 3 frames on her small kitchen table and began the work of integration. The first frame received the photograph of her surgical team, all 22 members before deployment, young and confident and unaware of what waited for them. She positioned it carefully, making sure each face was clearly visible, then sealed the frame. The second frame held the Highway 12 photograph. 12 people alive because she'd acted without hesitation when crisis demanded it. Evidence that her skills still mattered, that she could still save lives, that 5 years of hiding hadn't erased her capability. The third frame remained empty for a moment while she retrieved her phone and scrolled through recent images. She found what she needed in a photo Pauline had taken during a quiet moment on shift. The night crew at County General gathered around the nurses' station, their faces showing the comfortable camaraderie of people who worked well together. Lorelei stood among them, her expression neutral, but her posture relaxed in ways that indicated acceptance she hadn't shown before. She printed the image at the store's photo kiosk, then framed it beside the others. 3 photographs representing 3 different chapters of her life: past, crisis, present, not separate anymore, not compartmentalized, just there together, connected by the thread of who she was and had been and was becoming. She carried the frames to her bedroom and positioned them on the nightstand in a row. The wooden box sat open beside them, its contents visible and integrated rather than hidden. The combat medic patch with 4 names written on the back rested between the first and second frames, a bridge between loss and survival. She studied the arrangement for a long time, feeling something shift in her chest. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but something closer to acceptance. Acknowledgement that all these pieces were part of her story, and hiding any of them meant rejecting her own experience. Her copy of Catch-22 sat on the nightstand, worn from repeated readings over the years. She opened it to the passage she'd underlined so many times the words were barely legible through accumulated ink. He was going to live forever, or die in the attempt. The absurdity of that statement had resonated with her for years, the impossibility of the goal, the determination despite inevitable failure. But reading it now, she found different meaning. Living wasn't just biological survival. It was engagement, connection, purpose, things she'd denied herself through 5 years of careful isolation. She was learning to live again, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The week passed in steady transformation. More teaching, more genuine interaction, small moments of connection that accumulated into something resembling actual relationships, with colleagues who'd moved from strangers to acquaintances to something approaching friends. Veterans Day arrived on a Thursday, clear and mild, the kind of November day that felt more like autumn than approaching winter. Lorelei woke early despite having worked the night shift, her body refusing rest while her mind processed the decision she'd been avoiding all week. The ceremony would be held at the County Memorial Park at 10:00 hours. Public, event, local veterans recognized, families attending, media coverage, everything she'd been avoiding for 5 years concentrated into one high-visibility gathering. She could stay home. Nobody would fault her for it. Nobody expected her attendance. But Boone had said he'd see her there, and part of her wanted to prove him right, wanted to demonstrate that she could stand in public as herself, acknowledging service without claiming heroism, accepting recognition without believing it was unearned. At 9:30, she dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, the most unremarkable outfit she owned. But she pinned the faded combat medic patch to her collar, visible evidence of service she no longer tried to hide. The patch caught light as she moved, drawing attention in ways that would have paralyzed her 3 weeks ago, but now felt oddly appropriate. The drive to the Memorial Park took 12 minutes. Parking was limited, the lot full of vehicles belonging to people who wanted to honor those who'd served. Lorelei found a space at the back and sat for 30 seconds, breathing through the anxiety that wanted to overwhelm her rational mind. You don't have to go in. Nobody is forcing you. You can drive away right now and nobody will ever know, but she would know she'd chosen fear over growth, chosen hiding over integration, chosen to reject the person she'd been, in favor of the comfortable lie she'd maintained. She got out of the car and walked toward the gathering crowd. The Memorial Park occupied several acres of carefully maintained grounds, with monuments honoring veterans from multiple conflicts arranged in chronological order. The ceremony would take place near the central flagpole, where a small stage had been erected and chairs arranged in rows. Lorelei stood at the back of the crowd, trying to be simultaneously present and invisible, a contradiction that defined her current state of transformation. Captain Griggs spotted her first, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. He made his way through the crowd, dressed in his state police uniform with military service medals displayed prominently. "Lieutenant, I wasn't sure you'd come. Neither was I. But you did. That takes courage." He gestured toward the stage. "They're going to call out branches of service, ask veterans to stand and be recognized. You should stand when they call Army." "I'm not sure I can." "You don't have to, but you should consider it. These people came here to honor those who served. You served. You earned that recognition whether you believe you deserve it or not." The ceremony began before she could respond. Local officials spoke about sacrifice and service. A high school choir sang the national anthem. Then came the moment Griggs had warned about, when veterans were asked to stand and be recognized by branch. "All those who served in the United States Air Force, please stand." Several people throughout the crowd rose, their faces showing pride, mixed with humility. Applause followed, genuine and sustained. "All those who served in the United States Navy, please stand." More people rising, more applause. The pattern continued through Marines and Coast Guard. Then came the call Lorelei had been dreading. "All those who served in the United States Army, please stand." Griggs stood immediately, his military bearing evident even in civilian context. Around the crowd, others rose as well. 20, 30, 40 people acknowledging service. And Lorelei remained frozen, unable to move, paralyzed by the visibility standing would require. But then someone else stood. Daniel Boone, several rows ahead, turning to look directly at her. He said nothing, didn't gesture or call out. Just stood and looked, his expression carrying challenge and encouragement in equal measure. She could feel eyes on her now, people noticing her hesitation. The patch on her collar marked her as a veteran, even if she refused to stand. Staying seated was, effectively lying through inaction, claiming she hadn't served when the evidence sat visible on her clothing. Her legs moved without conscious decision, lifting her to standing position while her mind screamed protests. She stood rigid, hands at her sides, jaw set, refusing to look at anyone around her. The applause came, loud and sustained, washing over her like a physical wave. The ceremony continued, but Lorelei barely processed the words. She remained standing with the other Army veterans, locked in place by a combination of respect for those beside her and inability to figure out how to sit back down without drawing more attention. Only when the entire group was asked to be seated did she finally lower herself back to her chair, her legs shaking from sustained tension. Boone found her after the ceremony ended, his expression showing satisfaction. "Told you I'd see you here. You manipulated me. I gave you the opportunity to do what you needed to do. There's a difference." He gestured toward a group of veterans gathering near the flagpole. "Some people want to meet you. Word spread about what you did at County General, about your service record. People are interested. I don't want attention. Too late. You're getting it anyway. Might as well handle it with grace." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and handshakes and brief conversations with strangers who wanted to thank her for service they had heard about secondhand. She responded with minimal words and maximum politeness, enduring rather than engaging. But something shifted during those interactions. The weight of being seen, of being known, felt slightly less crushing than she'd anticipated. Captain Griggs appeared near the end, his expression thoughtful. "There's something you should know. I contacted some of the people you saved, overseas, the 18 from Fallujah." She went rigid. "Why would you do that?" "Because they deserved to know you were alive and well, that you'd continued, saving lives after you left the service, that your skills weren't wasted." He pulled out his phone, showing her a screen filled with messages. "They all wanted me to tell you thank you, that they remember you, that what you did mattered then and matters now." She stared at the messages, unable to process the volume of gratitude displayed in the compact digital format. Names she barely remembered, attached to words she didn't feel she deserved. But they were real. These people existed because she'd acted when action was required. That was undeniable fact regardless of how she felt about her failures. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just know that you made a difference. That lives continue because of your actions. And that running away from that truth doesn't honor the people you saved any more than it honors the ones you lost." The gathering dispersed slowly, people returning to their vehicles and their lives. Lorelei walked back to her car in a daze, processing. Experiences she couldn't fully understand. She'd stood publicly, had acknowledged service, had allowed herself to be seen and recognized, and the world hadn't ended, the sky hadn't fallen. She'd simply stood and sat and continued existing, slightly transformed by the experience. She drove home with her mind quiet, exhaustion replacing anxiety. The trailer welcomed her with familiar indifference, unchanged by her external experiences. But when she entered and saw the 3 photographs arranged on her nightstand, everything felt different. Past, present, future, all of it connected, all of it hers. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the images representing different chapters of her life. The combat medic patch sat between the first 2 frames, bridging loss and survival. But something was missing, some final piece that would complete the integration she'd been working toward. She retrieved the list Captain Griggs had given her 3 weeks ago, the paper worn from carrying, but never reading. 23 names. The people she'd saved in Helmand despite losing 4. She'd been carrying it without acknowledging its contents, unable to face evidence that contradicted her narrative of failure. She unfolded it now with trembling hands, reading through the names slowly. Some she remembered clearly. Others were fragments of memory attached to specific injuries or circumstances. But all of them represented lives continued, futures allowed to unfold, families kept whole because she'd made impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. She read the current status notes Griggs had added: retired, still serving, teaching, married, children, continuing education. Normal lives made possible by actions she'd dismissed as inadequate. The tears came then, finally breaking through 5 years of rigid control. Not grief this time, but release, acceptance, the gradual understanding that both things could be true. She'd lost 4 people, and she'd saved 23. Both facts mattered, both deserved acknowledgement. She cried for the first time since leaving the military, letting herself feel the full weight of loss and survival simultaneously. No more compartmentalization. No more hiding emotions behind mechanical efficiency. Just genuine feeling, messy and overwhelming and fundamentally human. When the tears finally subsided, she felt emptied, but somehow lighter. She carefully folded the list and placed it in the wooden box with her other mementos. Then she lay down on top of the covers, still fully dressed, staring at the 3 photographs until exhaustion pulled her into genuine sleep. The alarm didn't go off because she hadn't set it. She woke naturally at 1600 hours, the afternoon sun slanting through her bedroom window at an angle that painted everything gold. She felt rested in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Her body finally allowed genuine recovery rather than just unconscious time passing. Her next shift started at 1900 hours. She rose and moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, but small things continued to change. She made dinner without measuring portions exactly. She dressed without counting movements. She drove without monitoring every vehicle and scanning every intersection for threats. The transformation was incomplete, would probably always be incomplete, but it was happening, incremental and genuine, building towards something that might eventually resemble actual healing. County General welcomed her with familiar sounds and smells, fluorescent lights, antiseptic odor, the eternal beeping of monitors tracking countless lives in various states of fragility. She moved through the employee entrance, swiped her badge, and entered the space that had become something approaching home. Her locker held the photographs now. The coffee maker would produce 3 cups instead of 1. The residents would ask questions she'd answer with increasing comfort. Small changes, significant meaning, evidence of integration rather than isolation. Dr. Reyes found her at the nurse's station, his expression carrying news he seemed unsure how to deliver. Hawthorne, still getting used to that. Take your time. Administration approved the mass casualty coordinator position. They want to know if you're interested. Full-time, teaching, protocol development, active response, same pay grade as attending physicians. She absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind. The old Lorelei would have declined immediately, would have protected her anonymity, would have chosen invisible efficiency over public expertise. But that version of herself was dissolving, replaced by someone willing to be seen. Can I keep working bedside? Keep taking care of patients directly? That's the whole point. You'd be teaching by example, not from an office. developing protocols based on real-world application, responding to major incidents when they occur. He paused. You'd be doing exactly what you're already doing, just with official recognition and appropriate compensation. Then yes, I'll take it. His relief was visible. Good, because you're exactly what this hospital needs, what a lot of hospitals need, someone who's been there, done it, lived through it, and came back willing to share what you learned. The shift that followed felt no different than usual, but everything had changed beneath the surface. She was no longer hiding, no longer running, no longer trying to be invisible. She was simply herself, integrated and present, allowing past and present to coexist instead of keeping them rigidly separate. At 6:30, she clocked out and walked to her car through strengthening dawn light. The drive home took her along Highway 127, past mile marker 14, where everything had changed 3 weeks ago. She didn't pull over this time, didn't need to. The ritual had served its purpose. She'd acknowledged the past. Now she could move forward. The trailer sat exactly where she'd left it, unchanged and unchanging. But when she entered, the space felt different, less confining, less like a hiding place, and more like simply home. She moved to her bedroom, to the nightstand where 3 photographs sat in silent testimony to different chapters of her life. She picked up each frame in turn, studying the faces captured in those frozen moments, her surgical team before deployment, the Highway 12 after recovery, her current colleagues at County General, 3 different groups, one continuous story, all of it hers, all of it real. She placed them back in their positions, the arrangement creating a visual narrative of transformation. But something was still missing, one final piece to complete the integration she'd been building toward. She retrieved her phone and opened the camera, positioning it to capture the nightstand scene, the 3 photographs in a row, the wooden box open beside them, the combat medic patch bridging past and present, her worn copy of Catch-22 with its underlined passage about living forever or dying in the attempt. She took the photograph carefully, making sure every element was visible and clear. Then she opened the email application and composed a message to Captain Griggs. Thank you for helping me understand that saving some people counts even when you can't save everyone. Attached is proof that I'm trying to integrate past and present instead of keeping them separate. Thought you might want to see evidence of progress. She attached the photograph and hit send before she could second-guess the vulnerability the action represented. The message disappeared into digital space, carrying with it proof of transformation she couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. Her alarm was set for 14:30 hours, allowing time for rest before her next shift, but she didn't lie down immediately. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the 3 photographs that now defined her existence. Past, crisis, present, all connected, all acknowledged, all part of who she was becoming. The sun rose outside, painting her small bedroom in shades of gold and amber. Morning light caught the combat medic patch, making the faded fabric somehow more visible despite years of wear. She touched it briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than grief, then finally allowed herself to rest. When she woke hours later, her phone showed a response from Griggs, simple and direct, carrying weight that exceeded its word count. Proud of you, Lieutenant. This is what healing looks like. She read the message twice, absorbing its meaning, then set the phone aside and prepared for her shift. The work would continue. The healing would continue. Life would continue its endless patterns of challenge and growth and transformation. She was no longer invisible, no longer hiding, no longer running from a past she couldn't change. She was simply Lorelei Hawthorne, nurse, teacher, veteran, survivor, all of it together, all of it true, all of it finally, after 5 years of careful concealment, allowed to exist in the open where people could see. The Honda Civic started smoothly, reliable as always. She backed out of her parking space and drove toward County General, toward another shift and another opportunity to use skills she'd tried so hard to bury. The hospital appeared on the horizon, its lights visible even in late afternoon, a beacon drawing her forward. She pulled into the parking lot, claimed space 47 out of habit, and sat for exactly 30 seconds before exiting. But this time, the pause felt different, not anxiety management, not ritual control. Just a moment of stillness before engaging with work that mattered and people who'd become something approaching family. She walked toward the employee entrance, counting steps out of habit, but no longer needing the number for anything except familiarity. 47 steps. Always 47. Some patterns were worth keeping even when their original purpose had dissolved. The automatic doors opened, fluorescent light spilling out into the approaching evening. Lorelei paused at the threshold, looking back at the parking lot and the highway beyond, and the life she'd constructed through careful hiding and deliberate isolation. Then she turned and walked inside, toward colleagues who knew her name and patients who needed her skills, and a future that finally felt possible instead of simply endured. The invisible woman had become visible, and visibility, she was slowly learning, wasn't the catastrophe she'd feared. It was simply truth, uncomfortable and exposing and fundamentally necessary for actual healing. She clocked in exactly on time, her badge reading her name and rank and acknowledging service she'd finally stopped running from. The night shift was beginning, work waited, lives needed saving, and Lorelei Hawthorne, formerly Lieutenant Lorelei Hawthorne of the 274th Forward Surgical Team, was ready. Not perfect, not healed, but present, engaged, willing to try. Sometimes that was enough. If you've ever hidden the best parts of yourself because acknowledging them meant facing pain you thought would destroy you, or if you know someone whose quiet strength deserves recognition, they'll never seek themselves. We hope this story reminded you that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating past and present until both can exist without one consuming the other. Share your thoughts in the comments about the quiet heroes in your life. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing, because everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, even when that visibility feels impossible to bear.
I think what stayed with me most about this story is how exhausting it must have been. Not the work itself, not even the trauma she was carrying, but the constant effort of being invisible. 5 years of counting steps, 5 years of touching that box every morning but never opening it, 5 years of making sure nobody ever asked questions. That level of control, that kind of daily discipline just to keep your past buried. It takes something out of you that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. What made me uncomfortable, honestly, was realizing how many people around her must have sensed something was different but chose not to ask. Dr. Reyes noticed she was too calm, too precise. Pauline saw that nobody could be that private without a reason. Even that elderly patient recognized she'd seen worse things than a rural Kentucky ER could offer. But for 5 years, everyone just let her be invisible because it was easier than asking why. There's this moment that I keep coming back to. It's not the dramatic surgery or the public recognition scene. It's earlier when she's standing in that parking lot and a helicopter passes overhead. She just freezes, completely stops moving. And the detail that got me was that her lips were moving, like she was counting to bring herself back to the present. That moment matters because it shows you what carrying hidden trauma actually looks like in daily life. It's not dramatic. It's not a breakdown. It's just a woman standing in a parking lot trying to breathe through a sound that pulls her back to the worst day of her life. And then she finishes counting, walks into work, and performs flawlessly for 12 hours like nothing happened. That's the reality of functional trauma. You don't fall apart, you just keep going, and nobody around you has any idea what it costs you to do that. What this story really exposes is how we treat competence, especially quiet competence. We're conditioned to notice loudness, confidence, self-promotion. But someone who just shows up, does exceptional work, and never asks for recognition, we don't know what to do with that. So we ignore it. We take it for granted. And there's something deeper here about how we handle people who are carrying things. Lorelei wasn't just hiding her military service. She was hiding her survivor's guilt, her belief that she'd failed, her inability to forgive herself for losses that weren't her fault. And our culture doesn't really make space for that kind of complicated grief, especially not from people we expect to be strong. What struck me was how the people around her responded once they knew. They didn't pity her. They didn't treat her like she was broken. They just started seeing her clearly for the first time. Dr. Reyes didn't try to fix her. Captain Griggs didn't minimize her pain. Pauline didn't offer empty comfort. They just stood with her and said, essentially, you don't have to hide anymore. That's what respect actually looks like. The story also says something uncomfortable about bystanders. All those staff members who worked beside her for years, who benefited from her expertise, who never questioned why someone that's skilled was working night shifts in a place where nobody asked questions. There's a kind of passive complicity in that, not malicious but not innocent either. We're all guilty of it sometimes, letting people stay invisible because engaging with their reality would require something from us. A lot of people watching this have lived some version of this story. Maybe not combat trauma, maybe not medical expertise hidden in plain sight, but the feeling of carrying something heavy that you can't explain, the exhaustion of maintaining a version of yourself that feels safe but isn't whole, the fear that if people knew the real story, they'd see you differently, and not in a good way. You don't need a military background to understand what it feels like to be good at something, but afraid to let people see how good you are, or to have survived something that changed you fundamentally, but you can't talk about it because the explanation would take hours and people don't really want to know anyway. Or to be the person in the room who's seen worse, done more, lived through more, but you've learned it's easier to just stay quiet. Being underestimated is universal. So is the complicated relief of finally being seen, even when being seen is terrifying. Because once people know who you really are, you can't control their reaction anymore. You can't manage their perception. You're just exposed, standing there hoping they'll respond with understanding instead of judgment. I'm curious what moment in this story stayed with you the most. Was it the surgery scene where her skills were impossible to hide anymore? The moment Captain Griggs recognized her and spoke her real name? Or was it something smaller, like touching that locked box every morning, or counting 47 steps, or the way she couldn't let herself cry for 5 years? And I wonder, do you think she was right to hide for as long as she did? Or do you think those 5 years cost her more than facing her past would have? I don't know the answer to that. I think grief and trauma make their own timeline, and nobody can tell someone else when they're ready to be seen. What I do know is that the people who responded to her revelation with respect rather than spectacle, who created space for her to integrate her past instead of demanding she perform it, those people gave her something more valuable than recognition. They gave her permission to be whole again. If this story resonated with something in your own experience, or if you've ever been the person who stayed invisible because it felt safer, or if you've witnessed someone carrying weight they couldn't explain, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Not for engagement, just because these stories matter. The quiet ones especially. Thanks for watching.